Hey, well, good afternoon, everyone. We're starting on time today, and I hope you all who joined us on time have enjoyed the music. I just love the choice of our speaker today. Very appropriate for this time and much needed in terms of the uplifting message. So anyway, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Lisa Cooper, and I'm the director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Equity, and I'd like to welcome you to our February 2025 Health Equity Jam session. As many of you know, this is Black History Month. This is also Heart Health Month, and we're just thrilled to be with you today and to create this space for us to come together and to learn about very important and interesting work that's being done to advance health and to advance social justice in our society, and just to encourage one another and uplift one another. So today we have a very exciting lineup. We're going to start with our typical sort of informal introduction, which we do with our speakers. We like to know our speakers as people, not only as scientists and researchers. So we'll start out with some fun facts about our speaker, who is Joseph Cooper. And I'm sure people are wondering, is there any relation? Well, you don't have to wonder any longer. Because one of the speaker's fun facts is that he is related to me. So he is my nephew. So needless to say, I'm bursting with pride and excitement to have him join us today. So that's his number one fun fact. But he has some other fun facts too. So one of them is related to something that really is relevant for the month of February, because as you all know, this is Valentine's month, Valentine's week, and so it's about sweets. So I know we all have some favorite sweet or treat that is one that we go to all the time. So we're going to play a guessing game. What is our speaker's favorite type of sweet treat? And so put your guess, your best guess in the chat. We'll see if anybody comes up with the right answer. If you are a family member or if you know the speaker personally, no cheating. So let's see, we have Turkish Delight, we have Reese's, we have chocolate cake. Well, we're good in that we've got one of the ingredients is there. Chocolate is part of that treat, but there's a special type of treat or candy bar that this speaker absolutely loves. And you guys, let's see, you're getting closer with the Snickers and the Hershey's, but you're still not there. Almond Joy, getting closer. So we'll somebody got it. Bing, 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 bing. The award goes to Alasia Phillips, who came up with the answer, Butterfingers. So tell us, Dr. Cooper, about your love for Butterfingers.
Well, one of my first jobs when I first started working was many of you, if you are of a certain age, remember Blockbuster Video. My first job was at a grocery store in North Carolina called Winn-Dixie back in the day. But shortly thereafter, I began working at Blockbuster. And whenever new releases would come out, they would be on the back wall. But as you were checking out, they would always have all the treats, the popcorns, the sodas, and they would always have these discounts. And they would have the Butterfinger minis always available. And I just have fond memories of going to work. And when it was time to get off, I would grab some Butterfinger minis. And whenever I went to the movies with my brother or with friends, they would always get lemon heads or popcorn or Skittles, and I would always get the Butterfinger mini. So it's kind of an emotional imprint, as my wife likes to say, of fond memories of childhood and young adulthood.
Oh, that's awesome. See, I knew Joey loved Butterfingers, but I didn't know the whole story behind it. So you learn something new all the time. Well, another fun fact about our speaker. Let's see. We've had speakers that last week we had a speaker who was not last week, last month we had a speaker who was the mother of triplets. So how many people want to guess whether our speaker is a dad, and if so, a dad of how many? And if so, boys, girls, what's your guess? You can put that in the chat. Oh, somebody put 4 kids. Well, that person's cheating a little bit, even though they don't have the complete right answer, but they're close. Only because they've heard me talk about my nephew. I'm looking at you, Christina. Okay, people are like, girl dad. Okay, so Dr. Cooper, tell us about your kids.
Yes, yes, yes. We have 5. My stepson is 20 years old, Nathaniel McDormand. Our daughter, Nia Elise Cooper, is 6 years old. Natalie Jewel Cooper is 5 years old. Naomi Grace Cooper is 2 years old. And then our newborn, Nehemiah Adonis Cooper, is 3 months old. So my wife has been very busy the past 6 years. To say the least. And we're very thankful for all of our children, and they're a blessing. But as you can imagine, for all the parents out there, not a lot of sleep happening in the Cooper household right now. So, but they're just a bundle of joy, a lot of energy, and really exciting and honored to be their parent.
And I am honored to be their auntie, their great auntie. So, well, I don't want to be delay our hearing from our speaker too much longer. I know, Joey, I'm going to let you turn on your slides shortly, but I do want to give a more formal introduction of our speaker. He is Joseph N. Cooper, the inaugural J. Keith Motley Endowed Chair of Sport Leadership Administration and a special assistant to the Chancellor for Black Life at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. He earned his undergraduate degrees in Sociology and Recreation Administration from UNC Chapel Hill, go Tar Heels. His master's degree in sport administration, also from UNC Chapel Hill, and a doctoral degree in kinesiology with a concentration in sport management from University of Georgia in Athens. So his research agenda focuses on the intersection between sport, race, gender, education, and culture, with an emphasis on sport involvement as a catalyst for holistic development and positive social change. So he's actually also the director of the founding director of an institute. And I don't want to like take away, blow your, take away all your thunder. So I'm not going to tell them everything about you, but let's just say he's very prolific and productive. I've written 1 book. My nephew's already written 3, so so he is very busy, and you can see he's writing books and being a dad and all those wonderful things, plus a wonderful mentor. He's had so many different awards already for research, outstanding early researcher. He's already a tenured professor, and extremely well published and traveled. And so I'm going to let him tell you about his fabulous work, and you'll see how relevant it is to what we do here at the Center for Health Equity. So over to you, Dr. Cooper.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper. I appreciate you. Thank you all for being here. Whenever my Tanti invites me or asks me to do anything, the answer is always yes. I have a deep affinity for her, and obviously I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge both of my parents, my late father, Armand Jamale Cooper, who is my aunt's brother, excuse me, and then my mother, Jewel Egerton Cooper, who's also on the call right now. So thank you for being here, Mom. I love you. And my wife, Monique Cooper, who's also on. So love you too. And I think Tanti Don is also on the call as well. So
And your grandmother.
oh, Mama's here too. Wonderful, wonderful. Hey, Mama. Hey, Sis Julia. Good to see everybody. Very honored to be here with you all. And I'll go ahead and pull up my presentation, and really we can get into it. And then we definitely will also have time for Q&A. So give me one moment here. I'll pull it up and make sure. All right. All right, so thank you all for being here this afternoon. The title of my presentation is Racial Equity in and Through Sport, a culturally sustaining holistic approach. I know that some of the terms in my title are pretty controversial and taboo in today's climate, but I do think it's important to be committed to core values that champion all humanity, and that particularly have a focus on communities that have been underserved and historically marginalized. So this is just an overview of my presentation, my agenda. I'll do an introduction, a brief overview of my background. You all have heard a little bit of my professional and academic background, but I'll give a little more insight into kind of the path and the journey that I have gone on to become where I am today. I'll introduce some key terms. Many of these terms many of you are familiar with. You have your own operational definitions, and some of them they may be new to you, and I hope that you can consider incorporating them in your own work. I will then highlight an overview of a report that we published through the New Balance Institute for Innovative Leadership in Sport, which was the first ever National Black Sport Participation and Physical Activity report. So I'm really excited to share that report and the reasons why we decided to publish it, provide a socio-ecological context, which is the framework that guides my research, and a summary of the findings from the report, followed by recommendations. So a little bit about my background. I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina. I'm a former athlete. I played soccer and basketball growing up. And the reason why that's important is that um, all of my research in graduate school, I had a professor who said, research is me search. And what she was intending to mean is that the topics that we decide to investigate and explore scientifically are connected to personal inquiries, questions that we have about the world, about ourselves, and to put an African cultural lens on it, I say research is we search. So it has very much a communal, collectivist approach to it. So as a former athlete, after my athletic career concluded, my freshman year in college at the University of North Carolina, I experienced a post-athletic career identity crisis, which means when you've been deeply embedded within sports, particularly at a competitive level, it can be a difficult transition into life outside of that. And that was really a pivotal juncture for me in my development in seeking to explore my holistic identity. And that became foundational to my research, where when I did my master's thesis, at that time, I was interested in becoming an athletic director, and my master's thesis focused on critical success factors for Black male student athletes. I wanted to look at their engagement in personal development, engagement with a strong support system, social harmony, time management skills, career aspirations, and engagement with organized religion and spirituality. The reason why that context is important is after I completed my undergraduate and master's degree, I went down to the University of Georgia, where I studied under my advisor, Dr. Billy Hawkins. He's the author of a book titled The New Plantation: Black Athletes, College Sports, and Predominantly White Institutions, where I really began to deepen my knowledge of the intersection of sport with culture, with politics, with education, and with various aspects of society. I started my faculty career at the University of Connecticut in the sport management program. And then more recently in 2019, I came to the University of Massachusetts, Boston, to develop the sport leadership and administration program. So my research expertise focuses on sorry about that, focuses on the intersection of race, sport, and culture broadly. I view myself as an interdisciplinary scholar. So although my training is in sport sociology and sport management, I delve into areas of public health. I delve into areas of political science in higher education, K through 12 education, urban studies, and cultural studies. Earlier in my career, I focused more on sport experiences at historically Black colleges and universities for college athletes compared to historically white institutions. And then over the course of my development, I began to adopt anti-deficit frameworks and ecological systems to better understand how and why and when certain outcomes manifested in and through sport, which led me to develop a model that I'll be presenting to you all momentarily, which is titled Holistic Underdevelopment and Lifespan Socialization Through Sport and Miseducation. And if you notice, under and miss are presented in parentheses, which indicates that there are certain conditions that could lead to positive holistic development outcomes compared to those that are not as productive and positive. And then more recently, many of us are familiar with the burgeoning Black Lives Matter movement, or the movement for Black Lives that emerged in 2013, and obviously in sport in 2016 with Colin Kaepernick taking a knee before NFL games. And that really informed my work up until that point. So these are just an overview of some of the theoretical applications that I've utilized in my work. I'm not going to read off all of them to you, but the main point I want to highlight is in any of the work that we do, regardless of the discipline that we belong, I believe it's important to be theoretically versatile and to be able to pull from knowledge from various disciplines. So I've learned from organizational culture theory, I've learned from sense of belonging, constellation mentoring, critical race theory, and a number of other theories that have informed how I better understand lived experiences and social development outcomes. These are some additional theories and frameworks that have informed my work: community cultural wealth, productive Black masculinities, progressive Black masculinities, and even more recently, African Black diaspora, Black transnationalism, and Black internationalism. A brief overview of my methodological approaches. I am a mixed method scholar, so I've done qualitative and quantitative studies. I've also done empirical work, which has ranged from survey administration to secondary data analysis of large data sets. I've done focus groups, individual interviews, case studies, exploratory designs, as well as autoethnographic work. So qualitatively, my work has been as small as 3, and quantitatively, I've examined data sets as large as 24,974. So this is an overview of some of the works that are informing the presentation today. My first book was titled From Exploitation Back to Empowerment: Black Male Holistic Underdevelopment Through Sport and Miseducation, which focused on different socialization models that Black male youth in the United States experience throughout their lifespan. My second book is titled A Legacy of African American Resistance and Activism Through Sport, which was an intergenerational analysis of Black sports persons, particularly African Americans, who have utilized sport as a space and a platform for social change. And then hot off the press, 3 weeks ago, my most recent book, Black Sporting Resistance, Diaspora, Transnationalism, and Internationalism, which focuses on a global analysis of how African and Black sports persons have utilized sport for positive social change. I also have edited a few books that I just wanted to share with you all. One book edited with my colleagues, The Athletic Experiences at Historically Black Colleges and Universities, Past, Present, and Persistence, and Critical Race Theory, Black Athletic Sporting Experiences in the United States, and then Anti-Racism in Sport Organizations. So a couple key terms that I want to delve into just to provide a context for what informs my work. Many of us understand equity and equality, that these are related terms, but they are not always synonymous, particularly when we're talking about athletes and young people with unique and adaptive abilities. When we're talking about people across different socioeconomic backgrounds, equity can involve an understanding and a recognition of disparities that have existed prior to the present moment. So if you were to apply an equality lens to a context that there was already an inequitable arrangement, that equality approach will not always yield the desired outcome if equity is the goal. Another term that informs my work is sport desert. My colleague, Dr. Lori Martin at Louisiana State University, a sports psychologist, a sports sociologist, defines sport deserts as urban and rural environments with low access to organized sport and design physical activity. So many of you, I know I'm talking to public health disparity scholars here who know about food deserts and know about food swamps, but there's also sport deserts. And so it's important to examine to what context people have access to safe, high quality physical activity in sporting spaces. A couple of other terms that I want to introduce to you to set the context is the notion of miseducation through sport, which involves a lack of proper education that is culturally grounded in the background of the participants to understand how physical activity and sport performance can be integral parts of their holistic development as opposed to a limited part of their development. Athletic manifest destiny is a concept that is connected to the eugenics movement, which suggests that individuals who are part of certain racial groups and certain phenotype that possess certain phenotypical features are biologically predetermined to participate in certain activities in society. So particularly as it relates to Black youth, athletic manifest destiny has been utilized as a frame to say you are only going to be good at certain sports because of your racial identity, because of your gender, because of where you grew up. And so we want to challenge these racist assumptions and intersectionally oppressive beliefs that limit opportunities. Holistic underdevelopment and holistic development are concepts that are really integral to the work that I'll be presenting today. So when we think about holistic outcomes, many of us think about social, personal, we think about physical, but it also taps into areas such as spiritual, such as your global citizenship identity, the ways in which you're engaging not only with the world, but with the environment as well. A couple of other key terms that are grounded in social psychology are statuses, roles, identity, and self. So when we're thinking about connecting with young people throughout their early childhood through adulthood, understanding what are ways in which they are self-identifying, what are the identities that they possess, and what are ways in which social contexts designed to enhance the saliency of certain roles and statuses versus others. I'm going to highlight here momentarily that there was research done by scholars who received a grant from the National Institute of Health that found that young Black girls, young Black women, adolescents began to decline in their physical activity around the age of 13. And the reason being is that in many settings, including in school and community settings, that their status and their roles are becoming disassociated with athletics and physical activity, right? So this idea of womanhood is being defined in ways that are separate from mainstream opportunities within sport. And so we need to be aware of how do we make sure that we're identifying the holistic selves and the holistic identities of young people in fostering healthy development of various roles and statuses. Related to these concepts, role engulfment, role domination, role abandonment, and role engulfment as well. These concepts focus on to what extent and what are the processes by which individuals begin to neglect the development of certain aspects of who they are, student identity, leader identity, global citizen identity at the expense of their athletic identity or other aspects that they possess. So the term that is most commonly used in the literature is athletic identity foreclosure, which involves this notion of an individual primarily identifying with their athletic identity, but not fully investing in other aspects of their development. So there's a bifurcated dynamic that is happening in our communities with elite level athletes they are primarily being valued and supported athletically and viewed as exceptional. With a larger number of our Black youth, because they're not viewed as elite level athletes, there's a de-emphasis on healthy physical activity and engagement for holistic wellness. In both dynamics, there are problematic status quos or normalized messaging, normalized supports or lack thereof that are impacting their development. So we want to foster healthier athletic and academic role balance and strategic responsiveness to interest convergence, which involves an awareness of inequities that exist, internalized empowerment to engage in actions that change those realities. Other concepts that I'm going to briefly mention before I get into the report are surface level and deep level diversity. So it's important, oftentimes when we talk about diversity, we think about it on a demographic level and the idea of incorporating people from diverse backgrounds within one setting. But we really need to be looking at deep level diversity. How do people's attitudes, beliefs, and values begin to be inform the structural arrangements of particular environments? And then we want to combat racial socialization in sports, which involves, as I mentioned earlier with Athletic Manifest Destiny, racial socialization in sports is this racial idea that certain racial groups are predispositioned to be involved in. So if I were to say golf, tennis, swimming, equestrian, all of you immediately have groups that come to mind, not just individuals, but groups. But if I were to say basketball, football, track and field, you have another set of groups that may come to mind. That is not by virtue of individuals' capabilities, it's by virtue of socio-ecological arrangements that influence those patterns. The last key terms that I want to introduce is individual, institutional, societal, and civilizational racism. Most of our mainstream conversations focus on individual and to a lesser extent institutional racism. But within this presentation, I would like to get each of you to think more broadly about how societal and civilizational racism inform how policies and practices have been created to stratify certain groups in terms of access to high quality sport and physical activity environments. So I'm really excited to transition into our report. This is a cover page. I'll be sure to share the link. For this was our first research report published by the New Balance Institute for Innovative Leadership in Sport in December of 2023. New Balance, the Boston-based athletic apparel and shoe company, provided a $10 million gift to establish this institute, which focuses on sport equity, sport innovation, and sport performance and holistic wellness. And our three functional areas are research, education, and programming. So with this inaugural report, we focused on Black youth sport participation, Black interscholastic sport participation and physical activity, and Black intercollegiate academic, athletic, and social experiences and outcomes. We wanted to do a multi-level analysis to better understand at what developmental phase were certain patterns of outcomes and behaviors manifesting. Therefore, we could have more targeted interventions to improve these outcomes. So, as I alluded to earlier, the delineation between elite and competitive sport versus sport for development. So, one term that we use in our field, and it's also common in sport for development studies, is the plus sport model versus the sport plus model. Plus sport is the model that focuses on sport for recreation, for social connectivity, for even enhanced civic engagement, where athletic skill development is ancillary to the participation outcomes. The Sport Plus model, which is more prominent in the pay for play model, which is pervasive across the United States. So there's been, within the neoliberal context that we exist, there's been a proliferation of public recreation and publicly accessible sport activities being defunded, and there's been an increase in private pay for play, which obviously is going to privilege those who have the means to pursue that. So we really want to discuss this idea of accessibility, quality, and frequency. We also want to begin to expand the conversation about a range of physical activity and sport opportunities. The ultimate goal of the models that we're presenting is that sport is integrative to people's lifestyles and not additive. So it's not something that is optional or an add-on, but it's very much integral into their existence. And a big part of the model that we present is cultural resonance and connectivity. So the chart that you see here is from the U.S. Census Bureau. I know many of you are not surprised when you see this data here. So the summary is that Black people in the United States, including African Americans, Caribbean Americans, African continental Africans who have immigrated to the United States, constitute a disproportionate number of those who live below the poverty line compared to their overall population. So we understand that this is a part of the vestiges of slavery, of chattel slavery, of Jim Crow, of separate and unequal. And this is still prominent today in terms of access to wealth and resources. But this is important to contextualize as we're looking. This is a report shown by the Urban Institute, which also highlights that Black students are more likely to be enrolled in high poverty schools. This is critically important when you think about neighborhoods and schools serving as the conduits for certain outcomes, not just academically, but also athletically and physically and health-wise as well. So when we think about Black sport participation, a couple key themes I want to highlight is that African American sport and physical activity is often connected to racial identity development. So when we think about, if I were to say hip hop music, reggae, if I were to say gospel music, if I were to say certain religions, many of you could say, all right, I understand why that would culturally resonate with certain groups. But when we say sport and physical activity, we don't always associate a wider range of physical activities with racial identity development. In addition, there's research on Black girls that I highlighted in the report that my colleagues and I highlighted that shows that even though there's been an increase in a number of of girls and young women in sport, Title IX post 1972, when the Title IX educational amendment was passed, it actually does not benefit Black girls and young women at the equal rates that it does white women and white girls. So it's important to understand what are the factors that impact Black girls and young women's participation in sport. And it gets into these ideas of being an outsider, particularly in sports where they're the numerical minority, where sport activity and gender identity are viewed as contested identities, and then a lack of culturally relevant support as it relates to Black women's management and engagement with anxiety and related outcomes. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in 2019 published a report that outlined an ecological model that looked at individual, interpersonal, organizational, community, and public policy. That ecological model was very informative in the development of the model that we developed, and a sport leisure study scholar developed a similar model that looked at intrapersonal, interpersonal, and structural. More specific to sport participation and academic engagement, Dawkins and his colleagues looked at 3 different models that would explain how Black youth or African American youth are engaged in sport. One is the maintenance model, which says that I'm doing this to essentially to maintain a certain level of engagement that is essentially the bare minimum. So if I'm involved in physical education in my school, I'm doing it as a maintenance. Others use it as an incentive. So, hey, I have to be athletically eligible, so I'm going to maintain my grades to perform at a high level, and I'm going to focus on athletics. The model that we highlighted earlier and that Dawkins highlighted is this integrative model where there is an equal amount of investment in athletic development, but also academic development. And then in my own work, I've outlined 5 socialization models that explain how Black male youth have experienced sport, and I will highlight them more in detail here momentarily. This is the ecological systems model that informs the National Black Sport Participation and Physical Activity Report. So if you can see at the bottom, it's a black male, and this is an individual who obviously starts out at the youth age, but over a chrono system analysis goes through young adulthood or youth to adolescence to young adulthood to adulthood in various systems that influence the outcomes and experiences that they go through in and through sport. So within this model and the 5 socialization models, it talks about concepts that I want to briefly mention here, but we could talk more about in the question and answer. What constitutes negative and positive socialization through sport? What is muscular assimilationism? How does sport play into this idea of improving? Particularly, there's a concept called linked fate, where individuals feel like their individual outcomes or connections to those who represent or symbolize them are connected to the collective well-being. What is this idea of strategic responsiveness to interest convergence, and how do we delineate holistic development from holistic underdevelopment? So within this report, we pulled data from the Sport Fitness and Information Association. So they do a national representative sample where they surveyed and interviewed over 18,000 families, and they did a weighted adjustment quantitatively to extrapolate the sample size to represent over 300 million people in the United States. And the findings that you're looking at here are longitudinal data from 2012 to 2022, which showed that Black youth between ages 6 to 12 are less likely to participate in team sports compared to white and Hispanics. Now, you might look at this chart and say, well, Dr. Cooper, the percentages are not that large. There's only maybe a 5% gap between Black and white, and roughly less than 2% gap between Black and Hispanic. Remember, this is a national data set which represents 6 through 12. So even though that percentage may seem small, when you're looking at it over a national context, this could lead to larger gaps. What's even more alarming is that nearly half of Black families reported that their youth were not involved in team and youth sports. This reflects what my colleagues and I call as the youth sports participation racial opportunity gap. So many of you are familiar with the academic achievement gap or the academic opportunity gap, but we oftentimes don't talk about physical activity and sport within that same conversation. And what we believe from the literature, what could explain some of these gaps at the youth level are the increased pay for play models, which disadvantage, as I mentioned earlier, Black youth are disproportionately going to be enrolled in high poverty schools and to be living in neighborhoods with less economic resources, which means they're more susceptible to being in environments that are constituted as sport deserts. Some additional data looking at the adolescent age, is that we saw an increase in Black adolescents between 13 and 17 participating. So this finding leads us to conclude that at the middle school and high school levels, where there are more school-sponsored sport opportunities, even in urban environments, that they are associated with increased engagement for this population. So the youth sport racial participation opportunity gap is most pronounced at the earlier ages, 6 through 12, and that's important to acknowledge. This is another data point that highlights the aggregate data between ages 6 through 17. And as I mentioned here, that at the adolescent age, there seems to be an increase, but overall, the lower participation rates are largely attributed to ages 6 through 12. Moving forward, we have additional data that highlights what we call the structural constraints that impact core team sport participation. So core team sports are activities that involve participating in 6 to 13 games or practices over a period of time. So you're thinking about organized youth sport activities, which oftentimes will come through parks and recreation or in private and club sport opportunities. And what we found is that Black adolescents were more likely to be involved in core team sports than any other racial group. And so what that says is that there could be this manifestation of athletic manifest destiny and an illusion of singular success through sport, and or the idea of sport being an incentive or becoming an integrative aspect of their lives at that juncture. So although it's important to acknowledge how core team sports are beneficial for youth, we also need to acknowledge at what point in their development is it the most present. Now we're getting into the interscholastic level. This is at the high school level. We pulled data from the Center for Disease Control, and what we found is that there are alarming rates of physical inactivity for Black males and females. Particularly, there were higher physical inactivity rates for Black females, which are highly disconcerting. So almost 75% of Black females in high school do not meet the standard of exercising 3 to 5 days a week, and that's in moderate to rigorous physical activity. This presents a concept that we want all of you to think about. Is sport and physical activity a gendered racist space? Because if you look at the percentages for Black males, 55% are physically inactive, but that's a 20% difference between Black women, and Black young men. So this is where we really need to demystify the monolithic myth that all Black youth experience sport and physical activity in the same ways. Another additional findings that we found that students who attend large public urban schools on average are offered fewer sport opportunities compared to those in large suburban and rural schools. We describe this as the school sports structural resource gap. So if you think about the idea and the data, additional data from the Aspen Institute revealed that those students in large public urban high schools were twice as likely to say that they're not participating on high school sports teams due to a lack of opportunities that interest them, right? So once again, it's not about ability, it's more about access and quality support. Some additional data, we found that students from large public urban high schools are more likely to participate in school-sponsored sports for the purpose of earning a college athletic scholarship. So we're hearing a lot about in modern day, in 2025, potential threats to federal funding for people to earn federal support to pursue higher education. We know that many youth are accessing higher education through Pell Grants, starting at 2-year colleges and universities that are often more affordable as an entry option. Well, when we look at Black youth, oftentimes sport participation may be viewed less as a leisure activity, but more as a potential pathway for financial viability to pursue college compared to peers in other environments. Now we're moving to the final portion of the report, and then I will briefly highlight the recommendations and we'll go into Q&A. At the college level, there is what we call a Black overrepresentation phenomena. So if you look at the top graph there, Black men are over 5 times more likely to be on an athletic team than to be or part of an athletic department than they are to be represented in the general student population. The number is smaller for Black women, but overall, if you look at large Division I institutions, you are more likely to see a Black student who is a member of an athletic team than you are to see a Black non-student or a student who's a non-athlete. That is a signal that many of these institutions value Black talent in an athletic context, which often enhances institutional prestige, generates revenue, and prior to the most recent changes in name, image, and likeness policies, this was a large form of economic exploitation of not only Black college athletes, but also all athletes overall. Concurrently with this overrepresentation on athletic teams, Black college athletes graduate at the second lowest rate compared to their peers. So we see this overemphasis on athletic representation and performance and underrepresentation in terms of academic success as measured by graduation rates. We did notice that compared to Black students who are not athletes, that Black college athletes do graduate on average at higher rates. We attribute this to the academic athletic matriculation advantage. in order to be eligible to compete athletically, you have to maintain a certain GPA. And because if we think about athletics as an incentive, many of these college athletes are going to continue to persist by virtue of their connection to the athletic team. Whereas a black student, college student who may not have that same form or similar form of institutional attachment. But we also still see that there's gendered racism whereby black males who are involved in football and men's basketball graduate at significantly lower rates than black athletes in other sports. So this is not a unique phenomena to the Division I level. It's also present at the Division II and Division III level. So smaller schools, Division II, they offer athletic scholarships, but not at the same rate as the Division I level, and it's not as highly commercialized, and they are not required to offer as many sports. And at the Division III level, they do not offer any athletic-based scholarships. But we still see, particularly at the Division II level, that there's large racial disparities in terms of academic outcomes for college athletes. Some more positive data that came from the report is that when black college athletes do graduate, they are more likely than their peers to go on to pursue postgraduate educational attainment. So they're more likely to earn a master's degree and or a terminal degree. So this is really important to say, how can we focus on sport and physical activity as a facilitator for educational attainment and career mobility, not just in terms of professional sport aspirations, but also for holistic development. This is the last data report that I think many of you will find very poignant. There's been a lot of conversations around mental health, and black college athletes were more likely to report experiences with racism and racial trauma that negatively impacted their mental health. So this demystifies the notion that sport is inherently a protective factor from anti-black racism. And also black college athletes experience what my colleague, Dr. Eddie Como, described as athletic microaggressions. So many of you are familiar with racial microaggressions, racial micro assaults, racial micro insults, and racial micro invalidations. This similar form of mistreatment is prevalent among those who identify as athletes, particularly intersecting identities such as being black and being an athlete. So I'll conclude with my recommendations. I do believe many of you who have traveled internationally know that in many countries they have a ministry of sport or a ministry of physical activity. Many people assume that the United States Olympic Committee is a part of the federal government, and although there is a relationship, it is not similar to the Department of Education, the Department of Health and Human Services. So what I'm calling for is that there be an establishment of a U.S. Department of Sport, Recreation, and Physical Activity that would work in partnership with other departments to centralize research, collaboration, and innovation in this area. I also would like to help establish a national center for Black sport participation and physical activity that is focused on systemic, data-centered, and data-informed practices that would also provide data impact stakeholder leadership, which would involve multiple community members who are directly involved in impacting and implementing programs. I also propose a lifetime excellence through sport and growth and optimism framework, which I affectionately use the acronym Let's Go, which would really help us reframe how we discuss sport and physical activity as not relegated to one developmental phase in our lives, but something that is prevalent throughout our lifespans. I also think there should be increased private and public partnerships centered on Black youth involvement in sport and physical activity, and culturally respectful and expansive mass media coverage of healthy lifestyles. For the Let's Go framework, it focuses on access, education, personal development, culturally relevant and affirming spaces and activities, and lifetime engagement and commitment. So that's just a very snippet of the framework, and I'm happy to discuss it in greater detail here momentarily. A couple of my recommendations for the youth level: we need to really adopt more ecological systems approach and not look at neighborhoods and communities and schools as silos. I call for K through 12 teacher certifications to be reformed to include more culturally appropriate in sustaining physical activity and pedagogical practices which champion physical literacy. Increasing an emphasis on physical activity with the existing promise zones. So we already know that there are promise zones where there's increased investment in educational resources and other economically empowered, but we don't focus as much on physical activity and sport. I believe there needs to be an increase in culturally affirming gender specific and co-ed programming. As the data suggested, Black young women and adolescents at the adolescent age are experiencing unique detrimental outcomes as it relates to physical inactivity, and that requires a unique approach. We also need to revise the structure of existing community youth partnerships with professional sport organizations that don't focus on symbolic gestures, but more substantive investment in transforming outcomes in these communities, and adopt more data-driven, race-conscious socialization models, including the model that I presented earlier. At the interscholastic level, I believe we need more robust data collection on interscholastic athletes across diverse requirements. I tried my best to find data in the National Federation of Interscholastic High School. They don't have a lot of publicly accessible data that they share. And so what that means is that absent robust data, it leaves more opportunity for misguided. Many of the quantitative researchers in the audience are familiar with type 1 and type 2 errors. We want to avoid making those. And in order to do that, we need to have more confidence in what we are examining. I call for increased funding for large public urban school sport offerings, an excellence beyond athletics framework, which I'll present here momentarily, and then the prioritization of routine physical activity and interscholastic curriculum, and a revising of teacher and coach evaluations that prioritize holistic development. So the Excellence Beyond Athletics model, which I call the EBA model, has the following holistic development principles: self-identity awareness, positive social engagement, active mentorship, academic achievement, career aspirations, and balanced time management. As you can see here, these themes are very much connected to my master's thesis work. And so this is why this idea of research is me search is we search is critically important. And finally, I'll conclude at the intercollegiate level, we need to normalize and strengthen culturally responsive supports. As the data showed, mental health is particularly engagement or involved encounters with racism and racial trauma disproportionately impact Black college athletes. We need to help hold institutions accountable with equity action plans that increase investments and commitments to Black college athlete educational attainment during and post-athletic eligibility. So this idea when they take the uniform off, our investment and care for them doesn't end just because they're no longer servicing us in that way. Race-conscious data collection and analyses. Many of the data sets did not disaggregate the data by race and by gender, so we want to have more of that. We need to have a national metric for increasing accountability for eliminating the Black athletic overrepresentation phenomena and the racial graduation gaps that we observe, and then a multi-level adoption of the excellence, inclusive excellence, and anti-racism principles. So I'll conclude by sharing some resources of my colleagues here on the screen. There are various organizations that are doing great work all across the country, and I wanted to highlight them. None of us does this work alone. We are all a collective, and we all bring unique insights and talents and attributes to advance our collective cause. I also want to shout out my mentee, Batuli Kamara, graduate of the University of Connecticut, founder of Women and Kids Empowerment, which is an organization focused on Black girls in Conakry, Guinea, as well as in New York. They've done a number of clinics across various countries, which help promote positive Black girl identity development, helping combat sexual harassment, genitalia mutilation, educational underattainment, and a number of other detrimental social determinants of health for these youth. And so this really merges sport, education, and social entrepreneurship. She also is the author of a book called A Basketball Game on Wake Street. She is the 2021 Billie Jean King Youth Humanitarian Award winner for ESPN's ESPY Award. And I'm extremely proud of her and how she's used her platform through basketball to ignite positive change transnationally. And then last thing I want to highlight here is a edited book by my colleagues called Diversity, Equity, Inclusion in Sport. I wrote chapter 4 called Race Matters in Sport. And this is another useful research in addition to the other works that I shared earlier. So I want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Joey. Wow, that was really insightful. I know many of us do work that is related to um, physical activity, but I would venture to say that most of us don't even have we only have a surface appreciation for this kind of data. But I think it's so interesting, and it is so interconnected with a lot of the problems we study. We have people that study childhood obesity, for example,
Yes,
and know, for example, that some of the barriers and the phenomena that you described are probably directly related to those issues. So disparities in childhood obesity and the development of chronic illness like later in life. Even, for example, if people are experiencing discrimination and stress, what does that do to their mental health in adulthood? So, I mean, I found this just truly fascinating. One of the things I wanted to mention, though, to you is that you spent a lot of time talking to us about all these different terms. And I think in this current environment where we have so many people having conversations and using these terms in ways that really uh, demonstrate a lack of full understanding of what the terms mean. I wonder whether you have any thoughts around how we promote conversation around some of these issues so that people can actually talk about what we were really talking about instead of focusing on a term for which they may not have a full appreciation or understanding for what it actually means, right?
absolutely. No, thank you for that question. And it's very important. We talk a lot. So I give this analogy. So I'm a basketball player. I grew up basketball and soccer. But if I was communicating with a football coach or a hockey coach, I would use terms that are more common for them. So it's really, this is why when we talk about physical literacy and we talk about different types of literacy, it's about understanding what is the language, the context that is relatable to the receiver. So when we're encoding the message, I may want to say anti-racism, equity. I may want to use language like that. For some audiences, that may be a non-starter, or to your point, they may have a different operational definition of those terms than I do. So what I'll try to do is say, hey, can you tell me about your organization? What is your mission? Oh, so you use the term social impact. Okay, so let's see how social impact, and let's look at how social impact relates to disaggregated populations, right? And so oftentimes, if you start the conversation with a connective thread, people are more likely to listen and understand it. So a lot of it is just the translatability of our work. A lot of us academics have a hard time doing that because we're so indoctrinated in our own disciplines, and we're very skilled at using lexicon and jargon that appeals to a specialized audience. But I think we have to become more astute at translating and connecting with folks. And to be honest with you, this is grounded in a humanistic framework. Because if we're looking at this as we're all human beings, we all have basic needs, whether it's water, shelter, food. If you begin to start the conversation at that level, and then you say, hey, what are ways in which if we make these investments, if we collaborate in these ways, that it could yield certain outcomes? Another thing that I find helpful is using the data. And people can debate opinions, they can debate preferences. What's really hard to debate is concrete data, right? And so if you have a robust set of data sources, empirical work that can inform not just from a limited set of researchers, but almost like a meta synthesis of work that really builds the case that this is not something I'm making up. This is not inadvertent. This is something that is systemic and structural, which means that it requires systemic and structural interventions, which doesn't diminish the interpersonal and individual level change that needs to happen. But if we're really trying to change systematic patterns and outcomes with that. So to me, I always find that if you can use language that is relatable to folks, that's always the most helpful.
Thank you. Do we have questions from other people? I see folks, a few people on screen. Any questions for Dr. Cooper? I see Dr. Cruz.
Yeah, maybe I'll go first. So first of all, thank you. This is really, really enlightening, and it's a lot of what you talked about are things that I give frequent thought to, particularly what you were sharing about children who are, having access to playing on these, for example, these like travel teams. I have one of those children. And one of the things that I was wondering if you could comment on is when you think about how there hasn't been as much investment in actual school athletics and what we're seeing for a lot of sports. My daughter plays volleyball, for example. And what we're seeing with a lot of sports is because the children who are able to are playing in these private clubs outside of the school. There's not as much as an investment in that particular sport at the school. And I know I'm sure this is particularly the case for public schools. So wondering where do you see that sort of issue headed? And because I'm seeing this as I'm sure you have with a lot of different sports.
Yes.
And then what it often seems to lead to is that those children who are able to play on the private teams, they don't play at their school. And so it just sort of is a self-fulfilling sort of prophecy there. So just wondering if you could comment on the path forward on that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's a complex answer because as we know, public education varies greatly by state. So you've got state entities, and then you've got city and town municipalities. And we know that within our educational system here in the United States, property taxes, which help fund a lot of these opportunities, are very much socially stratified. So there's not an easy fix to that without something like a federal intervention that could offset it. But what I will say is what's fresh on my mind, my colleagues at the University of Maryland, College Park, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I'm a consultant on an NSF grant that they submitted, which looks at how data science can be taught and developed with college athletes. The reason why I bring that up, Dr. Cruz, is that yes, there's a defunding in sports such as volleyball, a lot of the Olympic sports, but concurrently there's a large emphasis on STEM education. And in many of these schools and in these districts, there's an emphasis on developing students who are understanding analytics, understanding coding. And what I'm calling for is more of an integrative model that says, if we're going to invest in these areas, how can sport and physical activity be a part of that development as well? Right. So this idea that I believe a number of athletes, if you start out teaching them about data science, using their own statistics, using their own, they're already interested in sport, right?
Yeah.
There's a number of coaches and people who are using their data in various ways. That could be the connective thread. And then you're able to teach coding and higher levels of analytics. So a part of it to me is reimagining the main problem that we have in the United States, and this is not unique to the United States, is actually internationally problematic, is that we have created this false dichotomy between athletics and academics. And we've created, it's kind of like this mind-body separation. And if you think about it, it's really nonsensical because your mind and your body are connected, right? So like even in a literal form, both have to be functioning at a high level in order for certain outcomes to manifest. We need to have a systems level approach to how we're investing in these various areas where sport and physical activity is integrated. So if there's going to be a school district that gets a grant for STEM, that gets a grant for enhancing facilities, that gets a grant even for the music and the arts, which is another area I didn't touch a lot into, but that's another area that's taking a major hit in terms of divestment, is because that's also being viewed as ancillary to other professional career pathways. And I would argue music, arts, and sports, as opposed to be viewed as ancillary or additive, I think they need to be viewed as integrative to these other areas. And the more that we can conceptualize that as leaders, as policymakers, as educators, as parents. I mean, think about it. When you take your child to go to a youth sport event, it's not just about them playing the sport and meeting. I remember as a child when my parents would take me to sport events, if it was in a certain community or neighborhood, we might also visit a museum. We might also go to something else in that community. So I was aware that this isn't just about sports. At a young age, I was very much socialized into your development, your personal development is not just about what you do on the field or on the court. It's actually very much connected. And at a young age, whenever I would get athletic metaphors, it would actually help me learn my subject matter better. So if I could think about my math class, my English class, my history class, my Spanish class, and I could make a connection to something that I already have a level of affinity towards, it allowed me to unlock a potential that traditional schooling, traditional funding, traditional models do not account for. And that's what I mean by the lost potential that we are not investing in by not having an integrative, holistic model. So I hope that's helpful, Dr. Cruz.
Yeah,
So
it
it's
is.
not an
Thank you.
easy solution, but it does require a reimagination of how we're investing and how we're viewing facilitators for students' holistic outcomes.
Thank you. Mhm.
Dr. Ebe?
Thank you. Dr. Cooper, that was an awesome presentation, and
Thank you.
it's great to see you
Likewise, you too.
after many years, and to see your wife among the people who are in the audience too. So congratulations to both of you for your lovely family.
Thank you.
This is just out of curiosity, and I apologize if I missed it, but I don't think I did. I was just curious what you thought about the NCAA ruling around students being compensated, because you brought up that excellent point about how much money student athletes generate for the institutions that they play for, and kind of the equity, considerations that we should be bearing in mind. And I was curious to just see, like, how does this concept of sports equity, and even the things that you said in response to the question that Dr. Cruz posed, how does this dovetail with students being paid to play sports? And what does that mean for students who are from structurally disadvantaged and racially and ethnically minoritized communities? Many of these students are coming from poorer backgrounds. So yeah, I'm just so curious to know what you think about that.
No, that's a great question, and thank you for that. So there's multiple issues at play that oftentimes get conflated. There's an economic exploitation dimension of the argument. There's a academic exploitation aspect of the argument, and then there's a broader holistic exploitation or underdevelopment aspect. And these are very much connected, but they're distinct. So from my perspective, there's data to show that out of 43 of the 50 US states, the highest paid state employee is a college football or men's basketball coach. When Nick Saban was the head coach at Alabama, his annual earnings were 14 times the earnings of the University of Alabama president. College sport at certain levels is big business. big business. AJ Dabanska, who is a native of Brockton, Massachusetts, projected to be the #1 draft pick in the 2026 NBA draft. He's going to BYU next year. It's estimated that his name, image, and likeness deal is upwards of $7 million. From an economic standpoint, I am not against college athletes receiving compensation for labor related to their athletic ability. My issue with it is that that's where the conversation ends. And I don't think that that's productive. I think what should be combined with the conversation is financial literacy and understanding investment, understanding that there should be also an educational trust fund that is also allocated for these same individuals, so that if they would like to finish their degrees later, if they want to come back, that there's an investment in that. I believe that what's happening right now is that many institutions want to benefit from a capitalist model, but they don't want everyone to benefit from that model. It's like you want to be capitalist when it is enriching certain individuals and groups, but you want to be egalitarian when it's disadvantaging certain groups. So for me, I think the name, image, and likeness, I think that's a basic human right, in my opinion. If you are talented and somebody wants to put you in a commercial and they want to, you should be able to benefit from that. No one else should be able to own your rights in that way. If they want to sell your jersey in a bookstore, you should be able to get money off of that. They shouldn't be able to do that. My concern is if you're going to pay athletes this amount of money at an educational institution, there needs to be a more integrated aspect of the education aspect of it. Otherwise, what we need to do is eliminate the hypocrisy and do what a number of countries all over the world do, is that they have a separate sport for development model that is not connected to the educational institutions. And if you want to be an elite athlete, there's a pathway to go through that. Now, there needs to be regulations and oversight over that model as well, because internationally, there's been a lot of emotional abuse, physical abuse, and other types of exploitations in that model. But what I would like to see is more, and this is why I keep bringing up the term holistic, there should be a holistic development model which says, if you're compensated in this way, these are the supports that we're going to provide to you for mental health, for financial literacy, for academic engagement, for community empowerment. So for me, it's less about just compensating the athletes. It's about eliminating the economic exploitation, eliminating the academic exploitation, and eliminating the holistic underdevelopment. Concurrently, there needs to be mindfulness in marketing and supporting, particularly women's sports. So we talk about Angel Reese and we may talk about Caitlin Clark. They're very much outliers in terms of the attention. Simone Biles, Jordan Chiles, who's competing for UCLA in gymnastics, they're outliers. If we're really going to have an equity-minded framework, and we want more women to have the earning potential in their sports similar to the men, we have to be honest that historically and contemporarily, we have overinvested in men's sports compared to women's sports. So for me, there's just, if you have a holistic framework that's equity-minded, it would allow everything from the policies, from the resource allocation to the metrics of success. So right now, you could look up which teams have the most championships and which teams generate the most money. What is less likely for you to find is how many of them have graduated student athletes that go on to get gainful employment, that go on to enroll in graduate school. How many of them have invested in the local communities? The irony is many of these mega universities that are generating millions upon millions of dollars are housed in the exact same communities right next door where gentrification, where underdevelopment, where lead in the water, where sport deserts, food deserts, radiation, cancer rates are through the roof. Once again, if you have a holistic equity-minded framework, the conversation isn't just about giving one athlete $7 million. The conversation is about how do we empower entire communities? How do we hold these institutions accountable? public and private, that are located in these exact same environments, right? You could look at a school like Yale University, right? Right there in New Haven, right? And if you look at the surrounding areas, there's a lot of the relationship between the university and the community is extractive, right? It's not symbiotic. And for me, that would be a part of the conversation. So I'm not against college athletes getting paid. I think there needs to be equity mindedness in the conversation so that it's not overtly transactional. Because even among professional athletes, studies have shown, particularly like in the NFL and NBA, it could be upwards of 50 to 75% of them end up being bankrupt or financially in distress later in life. So you can't just open up a checkbook and say, hey, I gave you what you need, because many of them will experience a post-athletic identity crisis like I did, and it'll be much worse because at least I wasn't making millions. I wasn't on national television and I was struggling. Imagine now, hey, those checks are not coming in the way that they used to. I've created a lifestyle that's not sustainable and I wasn't educated on taxes. So now that I'm making all this money, guess what? I'm going to be taxed. A lot of people don't know, like, for example, NFL players and professional athletes, they're taxed in every state that they compete in, right? So you might see somebody sign a $20 million contract. They're not getting all 20 million of that money. By the time they see it, it's actually less than half of that. And then there are other expenses. So there just needs to be a robust restructuring of the system. And I think we've got to have an honest conversation in our society. What is the role of sport in our educational systems? And we just need to be honest. Like, we need to just, if we're saying that, hey, we're only going to bring athletes here to play their sport, we don't care if they can read, we don't care if they're getting education. As much as I vehemently disagree with that, at least if you're being honest up front, everyone knows what it is. And we as a community and as a collective community can decide if we're going to continue to invest in that or not. So we've got to make educated decisions. If we keep funneling and feeding this system, remember, these systems don't exist without our investment, without our presence. If you took all the Black athletes out of all these sports, the whole sport industry would collapse, right? But that requires what I talked about earlier: strategic responsiveness to interest convergence, holistic consciousness, internalized empowerment, and engagement and counteractions.
Okay, so Dr. Cooper, we've got this is fascinating, but we got two people waiting. Yeah, we got two people waiting to ask questions, and we have one in the chat. So I want to make sure people get to ask their questions. And then maybe either you can both ask your questions, or Dr. Cooper can agree to make sure that he gives each person time to get their question answered. Which way do you want to go? Two questions?
Yeah, we can do two questions. That's fine.
Okay. All right. So I think Claire Liu is next, and then Christina Vincent.
Hi, Dr. Hoover. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was also a college athlete at the D3 level.
Yes.
So quite different. But I wanted to get your thoughts on going back to public school physical education standards. I think you're probably aware semi-recently, or I wasn't impacted when I was going through K through 12, but it seems that the past 10 years they have slowly reduced the standard of physical education, whereas something that I think a lot of us are familiar with is the presidential fitness test. Now they do like an extremely abbreviated version. I think it's quite easy. I think you don't need to be like physically active at all to simply pass. How do you think that has been impacting, kind of schools and sports as a whole? Because if you're privately educated or if you have access to the private clubs, you're not impacted. But if you were mainly relying on physical ed as fitness, by the time it's time to pick a sport, you're probably not up to standard as where you should be, or like even if you went to school 10, 20 years earlier, not up to those standards as well.
Yeah, that's a great question, Claire. Thank you for asking it. I mean, I think the physical education standards that you just mentioned, it's symptomatic of other metrics that are used in our broader K through 20 educational system that essentially devalue certain populations, right? So it's this idea that we're okay with certain populations being obese because it's going to fuel a healthcare system and a pharmaceutical system and private corporations in ways that in many people's eyes is not it's a good thing for it to be that way. So the incentives and the penalties for certain outcomes reflect who and what is valued. So if the healthy outcomes of these youth were valued, you would see that the incentives would be there for their value. The reason why teachers in certain school districts aren't paid as much, and we talk about property taxes and we talk about a lack of investment, is because those communities, if we're being candid, they're just not valued as much, right? Is that we do not value those communities in the exact same way. And we need policymakers, we need researchers, we need educators, we need politicians, we need politicians who are mindful of the harm that is done when you are making these decisions. Because it's this idea, on one level, we're trying to minimize harm reduction, but on another level, we're trying to enhance healthy outcomes. So it's not just about reducing the harm, it's about increasing the health and wellness. So to me, it requires a more concern. There needs to be a clear understanding of what are the healthy outcomes that we aspire to have for all populations, not just for those who live in affluent environments and those who can afford certain things, but for the populations that have been historically underserved. And then we have to have an equity-minded framework, right? And it's very difficult to expect people to have similar outcomes compared to other groups with not similar resources, right? It's not impossible, but it's extremely difficult. If I give you a state-of-the-art facility, I give you treadmills, I give you a nutrition, I give you access to all of this, and then in this community, you have a dilapidated field where there's, barely any lighting. You don't have any coaches that are trained through organizations like Positive Coaching Alliance and others. There's going to be disparities there. So I think it's just symptomatic of the same kind of testing culture that's prevalent in our K through 12 system, which says if you don't pass this test, you can't get access to this school and you can't get access to these resources. So I think we've got to have a more humanistic approach, to be quite honest with you, in terms of how we're creating policies and how those. So yeah, those standards that don't require you to be physically. Now, what I will say also is that we've got to be mindful at the college level, and I'm sorry, Christina, I'll get to your question really quickly. At the college level, the NCAA, they created an academic progress rate. To the spirit of the metric was to increase college athletes' graduation rates. What ended up happening is the schools that got penalized the most were limited resource institutions like historically Black colleges and universities. So to me, you can't just create like a blanket standard without accounting for historical and contemporary divestment and harms done to communities. There's got to be a level of equitable support for those communities too. So it doesn't mean that you're lowering your standard for health and wellness, but there's a way in which you're accounting for this community based on the systemic divestment. This is what's going to be required to get this community to this point compared to this community that might not need the exact same type of investment. So I'm all for high standards, but there has to be a comparable investment and sensitivity to the plights that are impacting these communities, because otherwise you're going to inadvertently reproduce. You had good intentions, but you're reproducing inequitable outcomes.
Well said. And Christina, you're on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this talk, Dr. Cooper. This has been incredible. I work really closely with Dr. L. Cooper, and she
Yes,
speaks
yes, yes.
with many of you. So really great to meet you, and really thank you so much for being here. I think a lot of, what you were just mentioning was I was an athlete as well. And a lot of what you're mentioning at the high school level was like same experience of, actually families who would move from one school to another, like this socioeconomic factor of like going to one school because it was this powerhouse program and
Absolutely.
the difference in opportunities for certain, people just because you're able to go to this one school and get seen and get recruited versus others. And I was actually more so interested in what your take is, like what Dr. Ibe was saying around the NIL and
Yeah.
education. I'm just interested as to your thoughts because it seems now like students are actually staying in school longer as a result of
Yeah, they are.
and the money they're getting paid. So I wonder how this will affect their educational attainment. But I know, I mean, there's so many other factors to think about as in terms of like transferring to schools and credits that, slide through the cracks and everything. But just interested to hear your take on that.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. I mean, my academic hat says we need to collect more data to determine what the outcome, because NIL is still very new. So
Mm-hmm.
we really don't know. Like the NCAA should look at data that says, is there a difference in the graduation rates of those who have secured NIL deals and disaggregated by the amount of the deal? Because a lot of these larger schools have collectives where they're essentially negotiating NIL deals for multiple groups of student athletes, including across various teams, but each individual athlete isn't getting the same amount. But to your point, I look at some of these athletes are looking at NIL as an incentive to stay in school. Because if I can make, I'll give a good example. Carson Beck was the starting quarterback for the University of Georgia this past year. Got injured near the end. So I thought the Dogs would have made a good run if he wouldn't have got injured. But he ended up transferring to the University of Miami, where his NIL deal is estimated 4 million. He's actually, if that is indeed true, he's actually making more than rookie quarterbacks in the MNFL, right?
Right.
And so, like, there is an incentive that if financially I can reap benefits for most college athletes, they're not going to go pro. Division 3, Division 2, Division 1. So your athletic potential, earning potential for many college athletes, the highest level it will be is when you're in college. For some of them in high school, but for many in college. So if there's a way that it can be used as an incentive to help eliminate some of the financial insecurities that many college athletes experience, because as you know, at the Division 3 level, there are no scholarships. So, you if you have financial challenges while you're in school, you really got to rely on family or others. That's not like the school. They may give you merit-based scholarships and they find other creative ways of funding you, but not every school is like those Power 5 schools that have millions upon millions of dollars to give out. So I think we've got to have a broader conversation that almost separates those schools. That's a separate conversation when you got a school who could pay a head basketball coach $10 million and get donors to pay one player $7 million versus a majority of schools in the United States. Exactly. The endowments are used to pay it out. The university is not paying those directly. So I think that we need to collect more data on NIL. We need to look at how the different schools are they supporting all athletes or some of these athletes negotiating their own NIL deals? What I've been seeing more recently in the news is a lot of parents are essentially serving as agents for their children, right? And so
A
they're
lot of info.
negotiating the deals, which is cutting the school. The school is no longer the middle person in these agreements. So the parents are going directly to a sponsor or a donor and saying, hey, for my child, this is what I'm going to negotiate. So I think we need to look at it in general. Once again, I believe name, image, and likeness are a basic human right. So the fact that college athletes were restricted for as long as they were was a gross injustice to me across all levels. There's no other population of people that you would say you can't benefit off your own name, image, and likeness for whatever reason, right? If I was a student at a university and I developed a software, I could get paid for that and still be a student at the school. Whereas up to a couple of years ago, if I was a basketball player and a car dealership wanted to give me money, I would be ruled ineligible for, I mean, at the University of Michigan, they took down the banners of the Fab Five teams in the early 1990s that went to 2 national championships just because they received money from a donor for their performance, which is, once again, this is at the same time that these coaches are making millions of dollars and the university is generating millions of dollars off of their athletic talent. So I think there's got to be economic empowerment, but it also has to be financial literacy. There needs to be some equity-minded conversations about how do we invest in a multitude of sports that have been underfunded for so long. And like I said, it really comes down to education to me too, because whether you're a D3, D2, or D1 athlete, you need to be educated on all of the aspects of the business of sport. So when you're a child and a youth, it's play. As you get older, it's big business. And you need to understand, and not that you have to be overly transactional, but you need to be mindful of the business dimensions of sport to minimize and eliminate exploitation.
Absolutely. Thank you. And your example of Carson Beck is very poignant. I'm a Florida State grad, so haunts me.
Oh, yeah. So, you know, yeah,
Haunts
yeah,
me
yeah.
really. Particularly Cam Ward haunts me, but that's a different story. So
Yeah.
I really
got you.
good time.
I think your Seminoles will make a comeback. Last year was a little tough. The year before, you all had a great year. That was
I
great.
know.
But
On
yeah,
cloud
last year was a
nine for
little tough.
that. I have faith in Mike Norvell. We'll have a better year next year.
Absolutely. I mean, it wasn't a lack of NIL investment last year because you all definitely paid out. Just the outcome wasn't what you wanted.
Yeah, next year. Fingers
Yes.
crossed. Thank you.
Well, as everyone can tell, sports is like a big deal and a big draw in this country and around the world. And I think we've learned a lot about the kind of structural issues that come up related to sport and sport participation and how it just sort of affects everything else. So this has been really exciting and enlightening. And thank you so much, Dr. Joseph Cooper, for joining us today. Thank you everyone for being here today. And it's good to know that we have colleagues and comrades across so many different disciplines, all working towards what we believe to be so important, that everyone deserves an opportunity to live a healthy and wholesome life. So looking forward to hearing more and to building collaborations. And we look forward to seeing everybody again next month for our next jam session. So thank you again, Dr. Cooper.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much. Keep up the good fight.
Thank you. Thank you for being there for us too. Bye, everyone.